There is a strange moment that happens in human connection when someone spends weeks, sometimes months, fighting what they feel, explaining it away, distracting themselves, telling themselves it is not that serious, and then one morning they wake up and they can no longer deny the truth. Because feelings that are real do not disappear just because someone is confused. They do not vanish because timing is inconvenient. They do not go away because fear tells them to stay guarded. And this morning may have been that moment for them. The moment where your absence felt louder. The moment where the emotional space between you and them suddenly became undeniable. The moment where every excuse they were using stopped working. What they have been resisting internally, they may have finally accepted today. Not because you chased harder, not because you begged for answers, but because the heart gets tired of arguing with what it already knows. And when that acceptance begins, it changes the way they think, the way they remember you, and the way they start moving toward you emotionally. Let me show you the signs of what may have shifted in them this morning. For a long time, they kept trying to make what they felt for you sound smaller than it really was. That is what people do when the truth feels threatening. They reduce, rename, and rationalize emotions because giving those emotions their real name would force them to confront something they do not feel ready to confront. So instead of saying, "I have real feelings for this person," they told themselves easier stories. They called it confusion. They called it temporary attachment. They called it overthinking. They called it a phase that would pass if they stayed distracted long enough. Every label served the same purpose. It allowed them to stay in denial while pretending they were still being logical. Because admitting genuine feelings is not a soft moment for everyone. For some people, it feels like losing power. The second they admit that someone affects them deeply, they also have to admit they are no longer emotionally untouched. They are no longer the one who can walk away unaffected. They are now vulnerable to disappointment, vulnerable to longing, vulnerable to needing clarity, vulnerable to caring whether this connection survives or not. And many people would rather sit in endless uncertainty than face that kind of exposure. So they kept themselves suspended in that middle ground, not fully in, not fully out, interested but guarded, attached but pretending to be detached, thinking about you but telling themselves it meant nothing, missing you but refusing to call it missing. They were trying to enjoy the emotional benefits of your presence while denying the emotional consequences of your absence. And that kind of internal contradiction can continue for a while, but not forever. Because the mind can only argue against repeated emotional evidence for so long. Every time they thought of you when they did not intend to, that was evidence. Every time your silence affected their mood more than they expected, that was evidence. Every time they compared another interaction to the depth they felt with you, that was evidence. Every time they tried to move on mentally and somehow return to you emotionally, that was evidence. These things begin as small disturbances, but over time they collect. They start forming a pattern too obvious to ignore. And eventually there comes a morning when the usual excuses sound weak even to the person using them. The internal script no longer feels believable. "I'm just confused" stops making sense when confusion has lasted this long. "It's not serious" stops making sense when your absence keeps hitting this hard. "I don't know what I feel" stops making sense when every reaction is pointing in the same direction. This is the exhausting part about denial. It demands constant maintenance. They have to keep inventing reasons, keep suppressing impulses, keep dismissing moments that feel emotionally revealing. But feelings that are consistent begin to wear down resistance. The heart keeps presenting the same information until the mind has no intelligent counter-argument left. And this morning may have been exactly that point for them. Not some dramatic movie scene, not a lightning bolt revelation. Just a quiet but deeply unsettling realization that they are tired of pretending this is less than what it is. Tired of acting unaffected when they are clearly affected. tired of saying, "I'm not sure," when every part of their emotional behavior says otherwise. Because confusion usually moves in circles, real feelings move in one direction, toward the person who keeps remaining emotionally significant, no matter how much distance, pride, or distraction is introduced. That is what they may have finally seen. You did not fade. You did not become irrelevant. You did not become easy to replace in their mind. Despite their attempts to downgrade the connection, your impact remained persistent. And persistence is hard to dismiss. Temporary things fade when ignored. Surface-level attractions dissolve when life gets busy. But something that keeps returning with force, especially in quiet moments, begins to feel less like confusion and more like truth. So now they are facing the one sentence they were trying hardest not to say. This matters to me. And once someone admits that internally, even if they say nothing out loud yet, the entire emotional landscape changes. Because they are no longer dealing with a vague uncertainty they can laugh off. They are dealing with a real attachment that asks for acknowledgement. Now every memory feels sharper. Every distance feels more noticeable. Every possibility of losing the connection feels heavier. This is the moment where denial starts collapsing under the weight of honesty. Not because they suddenly became brave, but because pretending not to care has become more exhausting than admitting that they do. They didn't fully realize it at first, because emotional distance rarely announces itself in a loud or obvious way. It doesn't come in dramatic arguments or clear endings. It shows up quietly in the gaps between interactions, in the subtle shift of energy, in the moments where something that once felt accessible suddenly feels slightly out of reach. And that is exactly what makes it so powerful. People often adjust slowly to emotional availability, so they also only notice its absence once it has already changed the atmosphere between them and someone they care about. This morning, something about your presence in their internal world may have felt different. Not necessarily because you did something new, but because you didn't do what they were subconsciously used to. No message arriving when they half expected one. No casual check-in that used to lightly reset the emotional connection. No familiar reminder that you were still emotionally within reach. And when that pattern breaks, even slightly, the mind starts filling in the silence with interpretation. At first, they might have tried to dismiss it. People are good at that. They tell themselves they're just busy, or it's nothing, it's fine. But the emotional brain doesn't respond to logic alone. It responds to consistency. And when consistency changes, attention increases. What used to be background becomes foreground. What used to be assumed becomes questioned. That's when emotional distance stops being theoretical and starts becoming felt. Because distance is not just about how far someone is physically or even in communication. It's about emotional accessibility. It's about how easy it feels to reach someone's world and feel like you still belong in it. And when that sense of belonging becomes uncertain, even small moments begin to feel amplified. A delayed reply doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels loaded. A lack of interaction doesn't feel like normal space. It starts feeling like a shift in priority. And they may not say this out loud, but internally, something like this begins to form. Why does this feel different now? That question is important because it signals the beginning of emotional awareness, replacing emotional avoidance. When things are easy to ignore, people don't question them. But when something starts to feel emotionally unstable, the mind naturally starts tracking it more closely. They begin to notice patterns they previously overlooked. They remember how often they used to hear from you without thinking about it. They remember how natural the flow once felt. And now, that natural flow is no longer there in the same way. This is where emotional contrast becomes undeniable, because you can only understand distance when you have felt closeness first. Without closeness, silence is just silence. But after connection, silence becomes meaning. It starts carrying emotional weight. It starts suggesting absence instead of neutrality. So today, even ordinary moments may have carried a slightly different emotional tone for them. Maybe something reminded them of you unexpectedly. Maybe they reached for their phone at a time they used to hear from you. Maybe they noticed how quiet their interaction space with you has become, and instead of brushing it off instantly, they pause for a second longer than usual. That pause matters because in that pause, emotional reality starts to surface. This is where the internal shift begins. They are no longer just assuming you are there in the same way. They are now becoming aware of what your reduced presence feels like. And that feeling is not comfortable because it introduces uncertainty where they previously had emotional predictability. And when predictability is removed, attachment becomes louder. They may start replaying recent interactions, trying to understand when things started to feel different. Not because there is a single clear moment, but because the mind always tries to locate a turning point. It's a way of regaining control over something that feels emotionally slippery, but often there is no single moment. There is just accumulation, slight delays, slight emotional withdrawal, slight shifts in engagement that only become obvious when looked at together. And once they start seeing the pattern, they can't unsee it. That is when emotional distance becomes real to them, not as an idea but as a felt experience. It creates a subtle discomfort, a quiet unease, because it challenges their assumption that the connection is stable, unchanged, always available in the same way it used to be. And underneath that discomfort is something deeper starting to form. The realization that your emotional space in their life is not as guaranteed as they once assumed. And that realization is often what turns passive awareness into active emotional attention. One of the most unsettling realizations that can surface in moments like this is not just that they miss you, but that nothing else is successfully replacing what they felt with you. And that is something most people don't admit easily, even to themselves, because it directly challenges the story they try to maintain about control and emotional independence. It is much more comfortable to believe that connections are interchangeable, that attention can be replicated, and that if one emotional space becomes difficult, another can simply take its place. But real emotional imprint doesn't behave that way. This morning, they may have found themselves moving through interactions, distractions, conversations, or routines, and yet something subtle remained unresolved inside them. On the surface, everything might look normal. They might be engaging, replying, scrolling, talking, keeping themselves occupied. But internally, there is a comparison happening that they are not fully aware they are making. Every interaction is being measured, not consciously, but emotionally, against something deeper that still lives in their memory of you. And that is where the discomfort begins, because no matter how many people they talk to, no matter how much attention they receive, there is a difference between stimulation and emotional resonance. Stimulation is easy to find. It fills time, it distracts the mind, it creates temporary engagement. But resonance is rare. It's what stays with someone after the moment ends. It's what reappears in silence. It's what lingers when everything else quiets down. And this morning, when things slowed down even slightly in their internal world, that difference may have become more obvious to them. They might notice that other conversations don't sit with them the same way. They don't replay them. They don't feel emotionally charged in the same depth. They don't create that subtle sense of meaning that your interactions used to carry. Even if those current interactions are pleasant, something feels missing from them. Not necessarily in a dramatic or painful way at first, but in a quiet emptiness they can't quite articulate. That's because your connection didn't just occupy time in their life, it occupied emotional texture. It had weight, it had familiarity, it had a specific emotional signature that their mind now recognizes in contrast to everything else. And once the mind learns that kind of emotional depth, surface-level experiences start to feel flatter without it. So they may begin to experience a strange kind of internal comparison. Not because they are trying to compare intentionally, but because memory automatically becomes a reference point when current experience lacks intensity. They remember how certain moments with you felt effortless, how conversations had flow, how silence didn't feel empty but meaningful, how even small interactions carried emotional presence. And then they return to their current reality, where things might be happening, but not necessarily being felt in the same way. This contrast is what slowly creates emotional awareness. It is not that everything else is bad. It is that very little else feels like it reaches the same depth. And that realization is uncomfortable because it suggests that what they had with you was not easily replaceable, not easily replicated, and not easily ignored. People often resist this understanding because it threatens their sense of emotional mobility. If one connection cannot be replaced, then it means it had significance. And significance requires acknowledgement. But acknowledgement also brings responsibility to feelings, to decisions, to clarity. So instead, they may try to minimize it at first. They might tell themselves they are just overthinking, that they are just in a reflective mood, that comparisons are not fair. But even while they are telling themselves that, the feeling doesn't disappear, because emotional truth does not dissolve just because it is inconvenient. What makes this stage even more powerful is that they begin to notice how often their mind returns to you when nothing else is occupying it. In quiet moments, in pauses between distractions, in the space where external noise fades, your presence reemerges, not as a forced thought, but as something naturally resurfacing, and that recurrence makes it harder to dismiss as random. So internally, something begins to shift. It's no longer just about remembering you. It becomes about recognizing that what they felt with you still holds a different emotional value compared to what they are currently experiencing elsewhere. And once that comparison becomes clear, even if unspoken, it creates a subtle emotional imbalance. Because now they are not just moving through their present, they are also becoming aware of what feels missing from it. And that awareness is often the beginning of reconsideration. For a long time, fear has been the quiet editor of their emotions. It doesn't always shout or take control in an obvious way. Instead, it works subtly in the background, reshaping how they interpret what they feel. It takes something simple and turns it into something risky. It takes something meaningful and turns it into something questionable. So even when their feelings for you were forming, fear was already there, offering alternative explanations that felt safer than truth. It would tell them things like, "Don't overthink this," or "This is just temporary," or "You're only feeling this because you're emotionally available right now." Fear is clever like that. It doesn't deny emotion completely, it reinterprets it, because denial is too obvious. Reinterpretation is more believable. It allows them to keep their emotional distance while still acknowledging something is there. But fear's real job is control. It wants to prevent emotional risk. It wants to protect them from vulnerability, rejection, disappointment, or the possibility of investing in something that might not guarantee a safe outcome. So even when their feelings toward you were genuine, fear would immediately ask them to consider consequences instead of connection. What if you get too attached? What if they don't feel the same way? What if this becomes complicated? What if you lose control over how much this affects you? And slowly, those questions start to feel like wisdom instead of fear. That is where the real shift happens. Because fear doesn't present itself as fear. It presents itself as caution, maturity, self-protection. And when someone is not fully aware of their emotional state, they often confuse caution with clarity. So they stayed in that controlled space, not fully expressing, not fully engaging, not fully admitting what they felt, because as long as they didn't fully step into it, they could believe they were still safe. Safe from emotional risk, safe from dependency, safe from uncertainty. But what fear does not account for is accumulation. Feelings that are not expressed do not disappear. They build. They circulate internally. They return in quieter moments when distraction is low. And over time, what was once manageable becomes harder to ignore. This morning, something in them may have crossed a threshold. Not a dramatic breaking point, but a subtle internal shift where fear stopped feeling protective and started feeling restrictive. That is a very different experience, because there comes a point where protection feels like limitation instead of safety. They may have realized that the very thing they were trying to avoid, feeling too much, caring too deeply, admitting emotional significance, has already happened anyway. The difference is, it happened internally without acknowledgement, and that creates tension, because what is unacknowledged still influences behavior, thoughts, and emotional reactions, even if they are trying to suppress it. So now fear begins to lose its authority, not because it disappears, but because its argument starts to weaken. The logic it used to rely on no longer feels as convincing. The idea that staying guarded keeps them safe starts to feel incomplete when staying guarded is also creating distance from something emotionally meaningful. And then a more uncomfortable thought begins to surface. What if I am not protecting myself from pain, but also blocking something real? That question is where fear starts to lose ground, because now it is no longer just about avoiding potential hurt. It is also about potentially losing connection, losing closeness, losing something that already holds emotional weight, and that creates internal conflict. On one side, fear still wants safety. On the other side, emotional truth is starting to demand acknowledgement. And when those two forces collide, silence becomes harder to maintain. They might start noticing that their reasons for holding back don't feel as strong as they once did. What used to feel like solid justification now feels like hesitation without direction. And in contrast, their emotional pull toward you doesn't feel weaker. It feels more persistent. This is where fear becomes less dominant, not because it is gone, but because it is being challenged by experience, by memory, by emotional residue that refuses to fade. And slowly, the question shifts from, should I stay safe, to something more revealing. What am I actually afraid of losing? And is that fear bigger than what I already feel? That is the moment where emotional control begins to loosen. Memory has a strange way of changing its tone when emotional resistance drops. The events don't change, but the feeling attached to them does. When someone is actively trying to stay detached, their mind treats memories like neutral data. Something that happened, something that passed, something that can be filed away without too much emotional engagement. But the moment internal resistance softens, those same memories start to regain their emotional weight. This morning, they may have found themselves remembering you in fragments rather than full stories. Not necessarily a deliberate reflection, but small flashes of moments that carry more emotional charge than expected. A conversation that seemed casual at the time suddenly feels warmer in hindsight. A moment of laughter now feels more intimate than it did when it happened. A pause between words now feels meaningful in a way they didn't recognize before. And what makes this powerful is that memory doesn't present itself with explanation. It just arrives, quietly, without permission. A feeling attached to a moment resurfaces, and suddenly they are not just remembering what happened, they are reliving how it felt. That is where things start to shift internally, because when someone is emotionally detached, memory feels like observation. But when emotional defenses begin to weaken, memory becomes experience again, and experience carries weight. It creates emotional presence in the body, not just the mind. That is why certain memories can change someone's mood without warning. Not because of logic, but because of emotional reactivation. They may have noticed this in subtle ways today. Maybe a thought of you didn't just pass through their mind. It lingered a little longer than usual. Maybe they didn't immediately distract themselves from it. Maybe, for a second, they allowed it to stay without pushing it away. And that small allowance changes everything, because it opens the door for emotional depth to return. Once that happens, their mind stops treating you as a distant concept and starts bringing you back into emotional focus. Not the version of you filtered through logic or distance, but the version of you connected to feeling. How you made them feel seen. How certain interactions carried ease. How your presence created a sense of emotional familiarity that is difficult to replicate elsewhere. And as these memories surface, they don't come alone. They bring contrast with them, because memory is not isolated. It always interacts with the present. So as they recall moments with you, their current emotional reality becomes more noticeable in comparison. Conversations that feel lighter elsewhere may now feel less fulfilling. Interactions that are functional may feel emotionally flat. Not because anything is wrong with them, but because the memory of depth has been reactivated. This is where emotional layering begins. The past doesn't just sit behind them. It starts sitting beside their present experience, creating comparison without intention. And that comparison creates awareness. They might start to notice that what they remember with you wasn't just about specific events, but about emotional atmosphere, the way things felt natural, the way silence didn't feel uncomfortable, the way attention didn't feel forced. These are not easy things to replicate, and the mind begins to recognize that distinction more clearly once it stops resisting it. And as this recognition grows, memory becomes more than nostalgia. It becomes evidence, not evidence of what happened, but evidence of emotional significance, because people don't repeatedly return to what had no impact. Repetition in memory is often a reflection of emotional imprint. So now, instead of pushing memories away, they may find themselves sitting with them a little longer, not necessarily analyzing them, but feeling them more fully. And that shift, moving from avoidance to presence, is subtle but important, because once memory is no longer resisted, it stops being harmless. It starts influencing emotional direction. It starts shaping desire. It starts creating internal pull toward resolution, clarity, or reconnection. And that is why this stage matters. Because they are no longer just remembering you. They are beginning to feel what those memories still mean. When someone finally crosses the internal line from denial into acceptance, something important changes in their emotional behavior. Staying passive stops feeling comfortable. Before this point, it is easy for them to live in ambiguity. They can think about you without acting on it, feel something without naming it, and remain emotionally suspended without pressure to define anything. But acceptance removes that comfort zone. Once they fully admit to themselves that their feelings are real, the silence around those feelings becomes harder to tolerate. At first, they may not even realize this shift consciously. It shows up more in restlessness than in decisions, a slight increase in curiosity about you, a stronger awareness of your absence, a growing sensitivity to the idea that time is passing without any movement between you. What used to feel like "we'll see" slowly starts to feel like something needs to happen. That difference is subtle, but psychologically significant. Because when feelings are unacknowledged, there is no responsibility attached to them. But once they are acknowledged internally, even privately, responsibility begins to form. Not responsibility in a formal sense, but emotional responsibility. The sense that what they feel is no longer just background noise. It is something that exists, something real enough to require attention. So now silence starts to change meaning. Earlier, silence might have felt like space, something neutral, something that keeps things simple. But after acceptance, silence begins to feel like distance that is growing on its own. It is no longer just nothing happening. It starts to feel like nothing is being done. And that distinction creates discomfort. That discomfort often leads to internal urgency. Not immediate action, but internal movement. Thoughts become more directional. Instead of just remembering you, they begin to consider possibilities involving you. Instead of just feeling, they begin to think about outcomes. What happens if this continues? What happens if nothing is said? What happens if you move further away emotionally? And this is where intention begins to form. Because action rarely comes from a single emotional moment. It comes from accumulation, a buildup of acceptance, awareness, emotional discomfort, and the growing inability to ignore what is already felt. They may start replaying conversations in their mind, not just for nostalgia, but to find openings, places where communication could restart without awkwardness. They may start thinking about how you might perceive them now, whether it is too late, whether distance has created too much space, whether reaching out would still be received the same way. At the same time, another force is still present: hesitation. Acceptance does not erase fear. It simply puts it in a different position. So while one part of them is moving toward action, another part is still calculating risk. Pride, timing, ego, uncertainty, all of these still exist in the background. But they are no longer fully in control. They are now being weighed against something stronger: emotional clarity. And emotional clarity has a quiet pressure to it. It does not rush, but it persists. It keeps returning to the same realization. This connection still matters enough that ignoring it is no longer emotionally neutral. It costs something internally to do nothing now. So even if they do not act immediately, their emotional direction has changed. They are no longer positioned in avoidance. They are positioned in consideration. And consideration naturally moves toward possibility. That is why behaviors often begin to shift after this stage. Small steps first: checking in mentally more often, reopening old memories with different intention, feeling the urge to re-establish contact but delaying it due to uncertainty. These are not random. They are signs that internal acceptance is starting to seek external expression. Because once someone fully accepts their feelings, they also begin to confront an unavoidable truth. Emotions that are acknowledged do not stay still. They move toward resolution one way or another, either through expression, reconnection, or conscious closure. And right now they are standing at that threshold where staying silent no longer feels like peace. It feels like delay, and delay after acceptance becomes harder to justify.